People who had a close encounter with a murderer / serial killer, how did it go? How did you find out that person was dangerous? There was a time when kidnappings were happening in my home country. I encountered one of the kidnappers at 6 years old who, true to the stereotype, offered me candy. Lucky for me, the only candy that has ever and can ever entice me to be stupid is Twizzlers. Lucky for me, he only had Nerds and Starburst. I ran off and told him no thanks. He picked up another boy that night. He R-worded and killed him. If he had Twizzlers, I'd have paused for at least more than the 15 seconds for him to close the distance. Would I have gone with him for a box? I don't know. Do I question my folks letting me walk home at 6? Kind of. It was 5 minutes from school and things were hard. I think about it all the time. That poor kid who probably liked Starburst. Story 2. Not my own story, but some family friends of ours had an experience with the Zodiac Killer. They were together in their car on Lover's Lane or whatever the spot was called where couples went to hook up. The wife got a weird feeling in her gut and begged the husband to leave. He was kind of upset because he was in town for one night from the military, so this was their one night together. Finally, she convinced him to leave. They told the only other couple at the spot that they were leaving because at the time the Zodiac was known to be active, so people kept an eye out for each other. Years later, the Zodiac wrote into the newspaper detailing one of his killings on Lover Lane. He described the exact car and said there were 2 couples left and he was gonna take both out before one of the couples went up to the other and gave them a heads up before leaving. Right when they left, he ended the couple that stayed. Every detail of the night, from the date to the cars to the time of the night, matched up perfectly, so they knew it was them who left just in time. Before I go to the next story, can you please subscribe? These videos take a lot of effort to make, so I would really appreciate it if you subscribed. Thank you. Story 3. It was my biological dad's 30th birthday, and we decided to throw him a surprise party and invited a bunch of people from his work. My brother and I were in our room playing on the Sega Genesis because it was all adults and we just wanted to stay out of their way. While we were playing together, a dude comes in and sits on our bed to watch us play. He said his name was Danny and asked us a bunch of weird questions. Do you take the bus to school? How old are you? What's your favorite food? He gave us a bad vibe and just seemed off somehow, like he was too interested in what we were doing. My mom comes in and sees him in there with us and tells us to go watch movies in her room, so my brother and I say goodbye and go to her room instead. A couple months later, my parents were watching the news and Danny is on the TV. He ended up being Daniel Conahan Jr., the Hog Trail Killer. He ended over a dozen homosexual men in our area and had tortured them and left them tied to trees in the woods to die. Story 4. I took a class offered by my local municipality for unemployed young adults. They taught us digital marketing and basic web design, and at the end of the class, they were supposed to get us jobs. Anyway, a few weeks after that class finished, I saw one of the best students in that class on the TV being held by police. He ended his 2-year-old by beating her for crying. I couldn't believe it. He was very calm and quiet and excelled at everything we did in that class. Never crossed my mind he would do something like that. Story 5. Not quite a murderer, but I walked home from a party when I was 17 because I had a fight with my boyfriend. As I was walking, I noticed a car go past twice but didn't think much of it. I sat off on the side of the road to take off my shoes and noticed the car going around the roundabout and thought to myself, must be lost, and kept walking. Then noticed the car park on the same street I was walking and turn its engine and lights off and thought to myself, they must have found where they were going. As I approached the car, I felt nervous when I realized the male was still sitting in the car, but tried to remain calm because it was just him and I on the street, so walked past. As I did, he opened the door and was completely naked and doing self-serving. I turned my head from him and he whistled for my attention and I bolted. I ran into someone's driveway and hid behind their UTE. He turned on his car and drove away. And I took the opportunity to run and hide in the park across the road. He did a sharp U-turn and drove into the driveway where I had previously been and was high beaming the area and yelling for me to come back. I ran the back streets in the area back to my house, and as I crossed back onto my road again, he was still going up and down the street looking for me. I ran inside and locked the doors. The next day, there was a news report looking for a similar car for questioning over a crime spree. I never found out if it was the same person, but learned my lesson about walking home alone that night. Too close and too scary for my liking. Story 6. When I was a kid back in the 80s, a friend of mine and his friend around the corner from me were offered money by a guy to go up to the field with him. I can't remember the specifics as it's a long time ago and I was very young, but I think he offered him money to pick blackberries. My friend said no, but the other boy said yes and went with him. His body was found the next day. He had been stabbed. He was only 8 years old. I remember the months that followed. Every parent was super wary about leaving any of us play on the streets. The kid's name was Kyle Curran if you want to Google it. It happened in Waterford, Ireland. Story 7. I'm in the medical field. A few years ago, I was on a forensic psychiatry rotation and went with the psychiatrist to do an assessment at the prison. There was a man there who had been convicted with undeniable evidence that he had brutally arsed and murdered a woman. We were there to try to determine whether or not he qualified as a dangerous offender. In the Canadian legal system, this means someone at very high risk of reoffending. In practice, this meant we were trying to determine whether he qualified as psychopathic, meaning someone who does not experience empathy. So during the assessment, he was friendly, extremely relaxed, casual, and even charming. When asked about specifics of the murder, he would brush them off or just make very vague statements. At other times, he would just smile or say things like, "Do you really think I could do something like that?" If I'd just met him on the street, he probably would have seemed like a very nice guy, but being aware of his offense, he came across as incredibly unnerving. Story 8. This was about 6 years ago or so. Can't really remember. I used to work at a truck stop in the town I live in. One day, a random dude showed up. Car was full of junk. Clothing he was wearing was all stained, looked like he crapped himself, and he had a very weird vibe about him. He was there for like 3 days, I believe. Day 1, he tried bumming smokes off of me, told him I didn't have any, and that was about it. Day 2, he changed clothes and left the dirty ones on the counter. I told him he has to remove them, as I was not going to touch them. He threw them away, and I took the trash out. Day 3, before he left, he went to the other side and asked for bags to put on his shoes. Weird request, no one gave him any and told him to go to the Walmart across the highway and buy some. A day later, the Fargo FBI showed up. Turned out his name was Henry Deniger and wanted for questioning about his wife being stabbed. The stain I thought was crap was probably his wife's blood. They had to dig through the trash to find the clothing, of course. They caught him about an hour from my town and told me that they'll stay in touch as I might have to testify seeing him wear the clothes and being at my job. Apparently, 2 of his ex-wives had been in some sort of freak accident that caused their passing. The other left before she got hurt. So we know he ended at least one, probably other 2, but who knows. Last I heard, he tried the insanity plea. I'm not expecting much to come out of it. Like I said, it's been about 6 years, so I'll probably never hear anything. Wasn't really anything interesting. I'll admit, it did make me feel uneasy when I found out. It's still probably my most interesting story about working there. Story 9. Okay, so this story isn't exactly what you're looking for, but close enough to share. When I was in 4th grade, I went trick-or-treating with my mom and best friend. We passed a guy who full up made warning bells go off in my head. We locked eye contact and I can remember every detail about him. I asked my friend and she apparently got the same feeling. We just kinda shrugged it off and forgot about it. A few weeks later, we had SWAT cars surrounding our street. My dad went to ask what was going on, and apparently someone escaped jail and was holding a family hostage at gunpoint in the house he was hiding out in. The hunt to get him out of the house went on for hours. Luckily, everyone made it out safely. The next week, the newspaper came out and I saw the guy's face, the same face I saw on Halloween night. Now, just recently I was thinking about this night. My family had the digital article saved, so I went to it and looked up his name. There was a concerning amount of news articles for this individual. The last one was from 2017, saying he was about to go to court on first-degree murder charges. Story 10. Years ago, I went with my mom to visit a friend of hers. Sat bored out of my mind while they sipped their teacups and waffled on all afternoon. The friend's rather weird adult son, quite a bit older than me, was also there in the house but didn't really engage much. I barely spoke more than a few polite sentences to him. My parents didn't tell me till years later, but he started stalking me. They would hear all sorts of sounds at night. I had no idea, just carried on as usual. Biked to school, stayed after for gymnastics, biked to the pool for swimming, etc. I'm not sure how long it lasted. Fast forward a few years, a young girl in our town went missing after school. A week or so later, they found her body dumped. You guessed it, it wound up being the son of my mom's friend. That's when they told me what had happened. Apparently, my mom finally caught him, and a word was had with his parents. Story 11. The person in question didn't murder anybody, but he definitely came close to it. The person is the man I spent 10 years of my childhood living with. My stepfather. He was abusive towards me since the beginning, covering up his abuse by saying it was discipline. This included verbal abuse, slapping, and kicking. If he left a mark, he'd say I hurt myself and he had nothing to do with it. After a few years, the abuse started getting worse. Once he slammed my head against the table, which gave me a black eye. Another time, he broke a wooden spoon on me. When I was 14, Mom had been in an unending argument with him for 2 years and had finally made the decision to leave him. She did it once before, but he lured her back in, despite my objections. This time, however, she decided to tell him beforehand. He took away everything important to us and demanded she give him the car keys. Mom refused, so the first time and last time, he turned his hand on Mom. 10 minutes later, he had left a minute before the police showed up. As soon as he started hitting, I grabbed the phone and snuck it away to call the police. And by the end of it, he had already done very bad damage to my mom. She could have died that day, and had it not been for all the trauma he had caused me, I could have followed my instinct to turn a knife against him. In the end, the police arrested him hours later, when he returned from playing poker with his friends. He was charged $3,000 and put on 12 months good behavior bond. We found out after the trial that he had been charged with domestic violence before and had been charged $5,000 on that trial. I would give anything to meet him in a dark alleyway and see how well he can fight when his opponent can defend himself. Story 12. It was 1989. My dad was driving down the road late at night. He lived in Florida. As he was driving, he saw a woman on the side of the road trying to hitchhike. My dad, being kind-hearted, slowed down to give her a ride. As he slowed down, he had a chill down his spine and had the worst feeling he ever felt. He did not pick up that woman. That woman was named Aileen Warnes. She had ended a man on that road later in the day. My little brother exists today because my dad chose to not pick that woman up. Story 13. When I was a kid, my mom was stalked by an ex who eventually ended her, his own 3-year-old daughter, and himself. I knew this guy for 1.5 to 2 years prior to the murders, but I remember the first time something really struck me as off about him. I came home from school and found him in our house. He'd broken in, but I didn't know that at the time, going through things in my mom's bedroom. He was acting kind of manic, like he was ruffling through things but not actually doing anything particular and not looking or taking anything. He kept talking to me about how he thought of me as his daughter. News to me, we got along but weren't close, and blah blah emotional stuff. It was weird, but he seemed volatile somehow, like he wasn't all there. So I just acted agreeable and started talking as normally as possible about the chores I needed to do before my mom got home from work, and left him in the room alone. He left the house shortly after without another word. I told my mom about it when she got home and she was pretty disturbed. Turns out she had just broken up with him and taken back his key to our house earlier that day and hadn't told me yet. We realized he had broken into the house through the garage, and at a time he knew I would be there alone. That was the beginning of nearly a year of stalking and several break-ins, eventually ending in him, ending her and his daughter before pulling the classic death by cop. Story 14. When I was a nursing student, I did a 3-week placement on a mental health ward. There wasn't a lot for me to do. I was just expected to help with medications and sit and chat to the patients. One day I was with a group in the craft room when a man arrived and sat next to me. I'd never seen him before and he was wearing a suit and was well put together. I thought initially he might be a member of the staff. He was very polite, shook my hand, and we started chatting. I can't remember what we talked about, but it was clear that he was very intelligent and well spoken. When I came back the next morning, he was gone and I asked my buddy nurse what happened to him. Turns out the man had a very long psychological and criminal history and had murdered 2 people. He was only staying on the ward for 1 night before he was transferred elsewhere. I wouldn't have ever guessed it. It really shows that you can't judge a book by its cover. Story 15. I worked at my dad's automotive shop in my mid-teens. I was basically slave labor, to be honest, and usually answered the phones, rarely doing any actual work on the vehicles. I was basically janitor meets receptionist. One day, he and his friend and employee Chuck go to pick up a car in another city. Towing it back will be gone at least 2 hours. A car comes pulling up to the drive. Older man with glasses gets out, says he needs work done on his car. I tell him that I'm just minding the place until the owner comes back, so he leaves. Fast forward to June 2005, 2 to 3 years later. I see that same older guy on the news. This is the report. Dennis Rader has been arrested and is confirmed to be BTK, the same guy who came to the auto shop when I was there alone. Needless to say, I retroactively crapped myself. Story 16. 31 December 2002, and I was 25. I finished work early as it was NYE and went to meet my sister and her partner for a couple of drinks before heading off to meet my mates at a party. I met her at a pub called the Camden Tub in Camden, London. As it was NYE, the place was absolutely packed solid. Strangely, however, there was a sofa with just 1 man sat on it and 3 or 4 other seats unoccupied. Result, I thought, and scampered across and asked if we could sit. As I got closer, I realized that the chap was quite old, disheveled with a ragged beard and didn't smell great. The 2 things that jumped out at me most though were the fact that he was absolutely huge, 6'4", 5-ish, and wide as a door, and he was strangely wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt, which just looked a little odd on him. Anyway, he grunted an okay, and the 3 of us sat. We talked amongst ourselves, not paying him much mind, but I noticed he was paying a lot of attention to my sister. She's a good-looking lady, so not that surprising, but he was staring intently in a creepy way. Suddenly, he butted in and asked her name. My sister, being the kind, hippie type, led him in the conversation and told him about herself. I asked what he did, and he said he was a video game designer. The t-shirt made a little more sense. Spider Dude kept asking for my sister's address and phone number, until her then partner asked him nicely to stop. He looked furious and didn't say much else, apart from to ask my sister to borrow her lighter. It got more and more uncomfortable as he continued to stare in a menacing way, so I suggested we leave. When outside, my sister remembered she hadn't got her lighter back off him. I offered to go back and get it. I picked my way through the crowd and back to the sofa where he was still sitting. I asked for the lighter, and he held it out. As I was about to take it, he pulled it back and asked if I would buy him a drink. I politely declined, and he threw the lighter at me. I went off to meet my friends, and my sister and her boyfriend went off to enjoy their night. On January 2, I was on my way to work and stopped off at the shop as usual to buy a paper to read on the train, back in the day when people still bought newspapers. When I got to the paper rack, I was absolutely floored. On lots of the front pages were pictures of Spider Dude. On one in particular, the Mirror I think, there was a full-length picture of him wearing the Spider-Man t-shirt. The headlines were Wanted or On the Run, etc. Turns out our drinking partner was Anthony Hardy. Hardy, over the course of the previous day or 2, murdered and dismembered 2 women and dumped the body parts in commercial bins in the area around the pub. He had then gone on the run. He was eventually caught when he went to try and pick up his medication at a local hospital. I called the police, who came to visit my office. I also called my sister, who was in shock. She left her flat, which was round the corner from the pub we'd met him in, for a few days and stayed with friends on the other side of London. Hardy was eventually convicted of 3 murders, but suspected of committing up to 9. These were definitely some disturbing stories, but if you have stories of your own, feel free to write them below in the comments so I can make a video on them in the future. Like the video and subscribe to the channel if you liked it. I'll see you in the next one.